So Spider-Man Reign is one of the darkest, but also best Spider-Man stories that I think I've ever read. And what's crazy about this is it doesn't feel like a Spider-Man story. I know, it's really, really wild. So what this does is this basically takes place in the future. There will be no Avengers, no other superheroes outside of Spider-Man. And what happens is you pick up with these kids who are basically just kind of graffitiing a wall, right? Where did you go? When they're suddenly set upon by what are basically like the Fingermen from V for Vendetta. They're more or less a police force, but not a traditional police force, just kind of individuals who have been tasked with keeping the city under control because New York has become a very dark place. And so one of the things that happens is like these kids who are graffitiing, they basically start getting like attacked by these guys, right? And that's when you switch over to Peter Parker. Now, because this is in the future, Peter Parker is just a really old gray guy. I mean, he's not Spider-Man as you traditionally know him. More so than that, the spider luck continues in the sense that there's this guy where they're planning for a wedding, him and his wife. And this dude's one of those guys where he's basically just a dick because what he does is he tells Peter that he used white roses instead of cream roses and that it basically screwed the wedding up. If you're the kind of person that like throws a fit over white versus cream roses, the problem isn't the florist, the problem is you. And so what happens is Peter Parker, because of the mistake that he had made and because of the fact that these folks don't have to pay for the flowers that were provided because a mistake was made, Peter Parker's fired. And so what happens is he makes his way back home, but not before bumping into one of the kids that was being chased by those cops. And what's kind of wild here, right? This is where things get kind of nuts. Peter just watches, right? Just watches and doesn't do anything, just sort of ignores what's going on to the point where like one of these guys is basically shot up. Now, ultimately he does step in, right? He does like try to do something, but it's not the Spider-Man of yesteryear, right? It's not the one who like goes into some alley, dons his mask, comes back out, cracks some quips and beats the crap out of these guys. No, it doesn't happen at all. Like literally this girl just watches him as like he walks away after having been beaten up by these guys. And she's like, you just let them take him? How could you? There's no one out there to help us, no one to save us, no one. And so it stands in stark contrast to the Spider-Man that we traditionally know, who always stands up for the small guy. And so what we do is we get a little bit of context in the form of a news broadcast. But one of the things you're going to learn here is that New York at this point in time is a very authoritarian place. So we don't know if the news we're getting is accurate news or if it's basically just propaganda masquerading as news. But what this guy says is he says it's time to break out the balloons and confetti. With an unprecedented decade free from superpowered crime, the city is ready to celebrate its anniversary of independence. In 5 days, Mayor Waters will launch the highly anticipated secret technology system promised to keep the city safe for the next 100 years. And so what he does is he hands his broadcast over to a degree to the woman that he's with, right? And she says, this technology system dubbed the Web is a response to a very serious threat of a super terrorist attack. This computer simulation released by the Reign last year shows the potential destruction if such an attack were to happen. By constructing a laser-powered protective barrier around the city itself, the Web would prevent such an attack. But not much else has been released to the public, but we are assured the project is on schedule to be activated soon. But that's one of the things to know is the Reign is essentially the ruling body, the political body, right? The police. You do have like a mayor, but it's just kind of like the inner circle that runs everything. And so what you do is you switch over to Mayor Waters himself, who's actually taunting Kingpin, because for the last 10 years, Wilson Fisk has just been connected to an IV drip. He is a shell of his former self. He doesn't really even have the ability to function in any real meaningful way. He slobbers down his face and so on and so forth. He's just not the Kingpin. And this is really the last you see of him, right? They just kind of taunt him. And it's really designed to show how much control that Mayor Waters and his guys have over everything. Now, there is also another guy here by the name of Sax. Keep him in the back of your head because he's probably the most important person in the story, more important than even Spider-Man. And so what ends up happening is Peter Parker gets back home and his wife, Mary Jane Watson, is waiting there for him, but she never says anything. Now, that's the first clue as to what's going on because it's actually really interesting. It took me reading it a couple times to actually figure out everything that was going on here. But the fact is, right, while Peter's there at home kind of doing his thing and going to bed and eating his meal, so on and so forth, what ends up happening is an older guy makes his way through the street, basically cursing these, Reign soldiers up and down, right? Just calling them everything but a child of God. But then you switch back to Peter, and this is when you kind of realize what's happening, that he sort of like wakes up and he says, I had this dream that you were gone. I was a lonely old man. It's been so long. He kisses his wife and then he wakes up in a bed by himself. So seemingly Mary Jane Watson isn't there. She's a figment of his imagination. He just hallucinates her all the time. So much so that like it drives him crazy. Now, of course, the question has to be asked, what happened to Mary Jane Watson is actually really, really tragic. Like it's a really sad thing that happened with her. But the bigger thing here is that this guy comes knocking on the door, the man who was cussing the soldiers up and down, and meets Peter Parker, only for us to find out it's a very old J. Jonah Jameson. And so as he's talking to Peter, there's a kind of camaraderie to a degree, really more so on behalf of Jameson than Peter, because much like what we knew from years before, Peter doesn't have much love for Jameson, so much so that he actually like slams the door in his face. But Jameson says, I've come a long way to see you, Peter. We have things to talk about, big things. I didn't expect you to welcome me with open arms, but Peter, we have history. And the package that he was carrying, he dropped in Peter's apartment before the door was closed, and he just tells him, open the package, Peter. I've been holding it for a long, long time. And so what he does is he makes his way back out into the street and basically starts causing a ruckus. And where it looks like the, insane ramblings of an old man, there's actually a kind of motivation to what Jameson's doing, because it's happening right outside the apartment of Peter. And so Jameson's just kind of like screaming at everybody, right? You guys, you cops, you political officials and so on, you liars, all that kind of stuff, right? All you average people that are letting this happen, you're cowards, right? Just kind of like screaming into the ether and just makes himself look like a crazy guy. When Peter opens the package, one of the things he finds inside is his old camera that he used to use to take pictures of himself when he was running around as Spider-Man. The other thing he finds, we don't figure that out immediately. Instead, what happens is J. Jonah Jameson is attacked by these particular cops, and he kind of like beats them up, right? Like he cracks one of them across the face, right? Gives him the old haymaker. And of course, they start beating the crap out of him, because what we're talking about here are basically a police force that abuse their powers because there's no real oversight. But while all of this is happening, Jameson is calling out to Peter Parker, because what he knows above all else is that regardless of how Peter sees him, Peter is an honorable man. And that's exactly what happens, right? He says, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for all of it, my boy. We have so much to talk about. And Peter comes out of nowhere. Now he's only wearing the mask, right? Like his old black Spider-Man mask. And he's there in like his underwear and, his socks and, right? He's standing there in his all-togethers, almost naked as the day he was born. But he starts taunting these guys, right? And one of the cool things that goes on, and you're actually going to notice this over the course of the story, when the mask comes on, his demeanor changes. When the mask goes off, he's just the same almost cowardly old man that he's been for quite some time. But he starts like cracking jokes and different things like that. And he becomes the Spider-Man that we know, right? The Spider-Man that we've read about for so long over the course of our lives. And in fact, he beats the crap out of one of these guys and actually like seemingly throws him off the roof, and the dude dies, right? Like Spider-Man's killing people here. And it's pretty extreme, because J. Jonah Jameson is just kind of like, okay, right? You're here now. Let's have this conversation. He says, I was a newspaper man, Parker. I dealt in truth, but you gave me nothing but lies. It's why I sold the Bugle. You made me a liar, but I'm willing to put that behind us. If I need you, the city needs you, they're coming. Can I count on you? What do you say? And Peter just like cold cocks him and walks away. Now he doesn't kill him, right? He doesn't like beat Jameson to death. I mean, Lord knows he'd probably deserve it. But at the end of the day, like, he just kind of leaves him there. So of course, Jameson basically recovers and almost kind of goes back to his old ways of being like the guy who shouts truth to power and that sort of thing. While the Daily Bugle has long since been sold and is now basically the news organization that's effectively a puppet for the governing body, he still kind of prints newspapers, things like that, and hands them out to people out in the world. And what happens is, by way of what's going on, and Peter just like taking pictures of himself when he was Spider-Man and so on and so forth, that J. Jonah Jameson starts disseminating these out and basically saying like, the masked menace, Spider-Man has returned. And so what it does is it creates a huge amount of concern for the Reign, because what you do is you pick up with Mayor Waters, who's just like a it can't be, right? Not now. He'd be an old codger at this point. Now, of course, Sax is like, you've seen the tape, sir. That old codger just took down 2 heavily armed Reign soldiers with his bare hands. And so that's why Waters is like, mobilize all units, right? Go after this guy. Like, we cannot have a vigilante superhero running around on the anniversary of basically the defeat and the annihilation of superheroes. Now, we don't really know if the Avengers are dead per se. We're not really told. They simply just don't appear here at all. There's no Captain America, there's no Thor, no Iron Man, none of that stuff. So we don't really know exactly how things transpired here. But what we do know is that Mayor Waters, in talking to Sax, basically says, we need to release special criminals that have powers that can effectively go after Spider-Man. And so what they end up doing is releasing the Sinister Six, but what they call them are the Sinner Six. Because one of the things to know about Mayor Waters is that while the Reign isn't necessarily this like exceedingly theocratic, dictatorship, that it does have theological roots. There are elements of it where it's almost kind of a religious movement of sorts. And that's why Sax says things like, there's a weapon that has conquered both devils and gods alike, science. And he says, microthermal explosives are being implanted into their bodies as we speak. If any of the 6 stray from the flock, they will be destroyed. And a fireball so great that it will tear apart fine grains of sand or drops of water. If they serve their penance, they will be released outside of the city's walls after the web has activated. The web will keep them from returning and give the rest of the world a taste of what we've endured. Like any who seek freedom, they must earn it. And so that's kind of the cool thing here is the story's told within the confines of the city of New York. So we don't know if superheroes fled. We don't know if they were led away from the city of New York on some kind of false flag mission, and then immediately everything just kind of shut down. The web isn't necessarily up yet though, so it's not as though the superheroes couldn't get back in if they were out there somewhere. So again, not a lot of questions that are being answered here. Now, another part of this story, which is kind of an on again, off again part, is a little blonde girl who's kind of running around and is a little bit mischievous, kind of a troublemaker, getting involved in what's basically a kind of resistance movement. And she ends up getting the attention of a girl named Casey, who literally tells her, I have a place you might want to see, a man you might want to meet. He sees the cage too, but he's got the keys. We're going to try the lock tonight. And so initially where this little girl is just kind of like, I don't know if I have anything to do with that, right? Like at the end of the day, right, Casey's like, look, there's a whole bunch of us that are meeting up if what you're looking for is a friend. So the little girl follows Casey. And so again, you pick back up with Peter Parker in the midst of him having a kind of nightmare experience and literally hallucinating Mary Jane Watson, even though he just doesn't really seem to realize that he is. But he's like, do you need help packing? I know what you want. Where are your things, right? Because his idea is we got to pack and we have to get out of town as fast as we possibly can. And he even says things like, what are you waiting for? It's not safe here anymore. So kind of this frustration with regards to the fact that MJ just never talks to him, never really communicates with him, none of that stuff. But what you end up doing is jumping back to Casey and this little girl, and you realize that the man they're talking about is J. Jonah Jameson, who is in effect starting an underground resistance movement against the government and the Reign police soldiers, which is a very dangerous road to take, but it fits perfectly in line with the nature of Jameson. Because for anybody who's familiar with Jameson's character, they will tell you, like, sure, he comes across as this really crass, abrasive personality kind of guy who absolutely despises Spider-Man. And more often than not, he does hate Spider-Man. But what he cares about more than just like getting rid of the Spider-Menace, quote unquote, is truth. He values truth above all else, except for Spider-Man, right? He doesn't mind cooking the books in order to make Spider-Man look bad. But the big thing here is he's saying things like, your grandparents got scared and locked you up in this city. I ran away before they could throw me in with you all the way up the mountain because I was afraid too, afraid to take responsibility. And far from that mountain, I watched them construct a giant tower to watch over you. And from that mountain, I watched them create a door at the top of the tower. It was then that I knew I had to come back. If the web is activated, this cage will become a physical force. He's bringing them to feast on your souls. The devil. You want safety, you want security, you don't look for someone else, you look inside. Because when you give away personal responsibility, you give away personal power. Well, tonight, we're taking it back. We'll take it back with one voice, yours. And if you stand beside me, that voice turns to two. Then the person beside you you makes 3. And the more we stand beside each other, the stronger that voice becomes until it's a chorus of will. And no law has ever withstood such a sound. And so that's where he tells this young girl, Casey, it's time to hack into the network. It's time to raise your voice. And so one of the cool things to know about this is that when J. Jonah Jameson says things like the devil's coming for you, there's something that he knows that has not been revealed to us yet. But before we get too far into that, what ends up happening is that by way of Casey, J. Jonah Jameson basically hacks the entirety of network television, radio, phones, the whole 9 yards. And so what it does is it comes on with this kind of voiceover broadcast from Jameson saying like, liars, thieves, and liars, all of them, wake up, look up. They try to fool us all. Look to the truth. And so it's basically kind of broadcasting out to the city. Spider-Man is still here. Spider-Man hides among us, and he's one of us. And so one of the things that happens here, which is actually kind of nonsensical, but sort of dope at the same time, is Hypno Hustler shows up. Now, for those of you guys who don't know about Hypno Hustler, this is one of the goofiest characters to ever exist in the history of comic books. Hypno Hustler would literally play music and hypnotize people to the point where they couldn't stop dancing. And he would use that to like rob banks and different things along those lines. He is an absolute goofball of a villain. And he's somebody you never take seriously. So much so that like his boombox fails. And when that happens, the soldiers open fire and they kill him. But Jameson, alongside Casey and this young girl, are watching all of this. And Jameson says, this is just the opening act. Watch closely, kids. You're about to learn something. And so what this does is it picks up with Peter Parker looking out his window while trying to get, again, MJ to pack and all that kind of stuff, and realizes what's gone down with Hypno Hustler and like all these soldiers. So he immediately dons the costume, goes back to being that kind of Spider-Man persona, and just starts trashing everybody. But what's happening is this entire conflict with Spider-Man absolutely demolishing these Reign soldiers is being broadcast on television for the world to see, right through their phones and the whole 9 yards. People are realizing someone is standing up to the Reign. The problem here is that in the midst of all this conflict, the Center Six arrive. And when they do, they seemingly kill Casey. Then we end up learning the Center Six are basically some of Spider-Man's deadliest foes, albeit older versions, right? You got Sandman, you have Electro, you have Kraven the Hunter, you have Mysterio. These guys are incredibly capable. And in fact, Kraven starts trashing Spider-Man, and then he rips his mask off and reveals that he's just an old guy, right? Weak, just like the rest of us, is the kind of comment that this blonde girl says. And the reality here is pulling off the mask of Peter Parker would seemingly do more damage to the resistance movement than anything else. Because in the same way that the popularity of Spider-Man was due to the fact that it could be anybody under the mask, and a reader of Spider-Man's comics could see themselves under the mask. At the same time, people, these individuals who were looking for some measure of inspiration, could put any face they wanted to under the mask. Somebody who looks exactly like them, somebody as young as them or as old as them, right? That kind of thing. But now they see his face, and he's just an old man. But while the Center Six are getting ready to kill Peter Parker, tentacles come out of nowhere, and they immediately whisk up Peter Parker and take him away. And so what you do here is you pick up with Peter out in a graveyard, and you end up realizing he was brought here by Dr. Octopus's tentacles. Now, the reason why I say that is because Dr. Octopus is dead, but he had tasked his tentacles with a kind of assignment to guard Peter Parker, to keep an eye on him, and when the right moment came, to bring Peter Parker to this graveyard. The reason being because this is where Mary Jane Watson, Ben, and May are all buried. And what it means is that for the first time, Peter has to come to terms with what actually happened to Mary Jane Watson. Now, this is when things really start to go off the rails with regards to like Mayor Waters and all that. But before we transition to that, focusing on Peter, what happens is the tentacles basically communicate with Peter by way of Dr. Octopus's voice. And it says, Spider-Man, we were once gods of a new age, but like Balder, god of the sun, you had been taken to the underworld. And as my body succumbed to age, I realized the age of gods was dying away, a silent Ragnarok. All I left were my 4 sons, and I gave them one last mission, to enter the underworld and find you, no matter how long it took, and then to exchange my body for yours, my gift to you, my brother. And so he says, return the fire to the heavens, Peter, bring them all back. And so Peter basically ends up going into the coffin. And when he does, he starts coming to terms with things. And what we end up finding out here is the reason why Mary Jane Watson died was because Peter gave her radiation sickness, that the radiation in his blood is what killed her. Every time he kissed her, every time she kissed him, every time they were physically together and intimate, whatever it was, each instance she was dying more and more. And so the result of that was that Peter blames himself for her death. And he says that, "Oh God, I'm sorry. The doctors didn't understand how it happened, how you had been poisoned with radioactivity, how your body slowly became riddled with cancer. But I did. I am filled with radioactive blood. And not just blood, every fluid, touching me, loving me killed you. Like a spider crawling up inside your body and laying 1,000 eggs of cancer, I killed you. In those last precious moments, I didn't even share them with you. Too busy catching crooks. When I came back, your bed was already empty. I once said that I'd sooner rip out my still beating heart from my own chest before I ever hurt you. But I'm a liar." And so what he does is he just kind of hallucinates her talking to him. And she was like, "Stop being silly," right? "That last day, you never let me finish before you left when I said go. What I was trying to tell you was, go get him, Tiger." And so ultimately Peter goes back to his normal self, the Spider-Man that he'd always been, because he's finally able to let this guilt rest, to let this thing that's been eating him alive just move on and then become his normal self. Now, as far as everything goes with Mayor Waters, this is where things get nuts, because J. Jonah Jameson is literally snatched up by the Reign soldiers and brought before Waters. And Waters kind of torments him, right? Gives him a hard time, that sort of thing. And what ends up happening is Waters runs up on him with basically a knife with the intention of stabbing him, but then Jameson just like grabs a knife out of his hand, tackles him, and stabs him in the throat, right? Like goes to kill this guy. And then Jameson goes to stab Sax, except Sax doesn't die. Instead, a black goo starts to emanate from Sax. That's right, guys. Sax is Venom. Now, here's the cool thing, right? It was like the coolest twist to this whole thing, that Venom was basically behind all of this. More so than that, while Waters isn't necessarily dead, I guess it's really more of a flesh injury, so I misspoke there. J. Jonah Jameson figured this out, right? He knew what was going on, that it was Venom seemingly this entire time. Now, the coolest thing about this is that Jameson didn't necessarily know that it was Venom, but he suspected it. And in fact, we're told as much, right? That Sax asked, "How long have you known?" And Jameson responds, "I didn't, but I had suspicions. I'm a newsman, Sax. I needed to know for sure before I could report it." And so while Waters spends all this time playing politician, right? We can work this out, at the end of the day, he doesn't realize that like this is way beyond his control. There's nothing he can do to undo all of this. And so one of the things that Sax says is he says, "Newsman, even back then, you treated Eddie like garbage. You remember Eddie, right? He's still a part of me. I've helped him grow as a person, become a better man, but he remembers what you were." So ultimately, it's kind of him saying like, you're not the guy that you think you are, the savior, the hero, that kind of a thing. You're still a really, really crappy person, right? You're just trying to make up for it, but ultimately you'll never truly be successful. And so what ends up going on is that Waters being directed by Venom, because Waters is a believer in the idea of protecting New York, but he also recognizes that if he were to defy Venom, that Venom would simply just kill him. He just says, okay, then like activate phase 2, which is the official activation of this web. And that if this web goes to 100%, there'll be no escaping. More so than that, the intention of Sax directing Waters to do all of this, and really the intention of Venom, right, if we just stop using the name Sax, is that with the entirety of the city of New York enclosed, it becomes a feeding ground for Venom, right? He can literally just turn the entirety of the city into him. And then once he has an army large enough that cannot be defeated through conventional means, the barrier effectively comes up and then everything else gets invaded. And it's only a matter of time before Venom takes over and consumes everything. So it's very much kind of relying on the old school mentality of Venom as we knew him in the early to mid 1990s, as opposed to Venom as we see him now. And that's one of the things that makes so much of this crazy, because at this point, it's a race against time. And so what you do is you switch over to this younger blonde girl, right? That Casey basically is seemingly taken out. And this younger blonde girl is kind of doing what she can, where she can, to try to stay away from Venom, but to also try to protect other people from Venom, whether it's warning them about what's going on or any number of things. But what she also does here is she picks up where Jameson left off. That ever since the rise of the Reign, right, when they came to power, seemingly like 30 years before this story takes place, they of course outlawed masks. That being a vigilante is essentially illegal, and wearing a mask is even more illegal than that. But at the end of the day, she's like, we don't care. We're standing for something. And with our masks, we're going to stand against the city and show that we can take the city back. The city cannot control us. And so switching over to Peter Parker, because of the fact that he's now come to terms with everything, he redons his classic Spider-Man outfit and immediately heads straight out to where everybody is to jump into the main conflict itself. Now, the other cool thing that goes on is that with all these little roads converging into essentially the tower that belongs to the Reign in the city of New York, that this younger blonde girl actually brings a giant bell with them, which is one of the reasons why all across the city of New York, bells, anything that emits sonic pulses, they had all basically been banned. I didn't mention that earlier because honestly, I feel like it would have been a dead giveaway regarding Venom, right? So I just didn't want to like tell you guys that, but she's genius in the sense that as long as they're hitting this bell, that the symbiotes will always stay away from them, right? Because symbiotes hate sonics, right? Sonic pulses, high frequencies, loud sounds, different things like that. Not only that, what also happens with regards to Peter is he enters into the tower directly. And so while Peter is going to face off against the other members of the Center Six, you pick up with Sandman, who's one of the soldiers here, and he sees the blonde girl and he says, my throat goes dry even for sand. She has my eyes. So many years. What was her name? Sally, Sonia, Susie? But ultimately the other soldiers are like, she's an illegal. She's wearing a mask. Cut her down. And they go to fire at her. Now, of course, Sandman jumps in and it's just like, no, right? And tries to stop them. Ultimately, she's hit, right? Like she's mortally injured because of what happened. But Sandman kind of grabs her. And because of the fact that she essentially inherited his powers, her body isn't destroyed in the traditional sense. That much like Sandman, she can actually convert herself into a sand form and will herself back to her physical form, right? Essentially heal herself. But the problem with this is she doesn't quite have powers on the same level that he does, or at the very least hasn't mastered them the same way that he has. And so ultimately she ends up dying, right? She's like, my arms and legs are too far apart. And while Sandman goes to essentially grab the pieces of her in order to try to save her, it doesn't make any difference, right? Again, that's why she ends up dying here, which of course pisses Sandman off to no end. But picking up with Spider-Man, he deals with the Sinister Six, or the Center Six, pretty quickly, right? There's this moment where Electro and Hydro Man are basically in a room with sprinkler systems. Not the smartest thing if you're Electro, genius if you're Hydro. But Spider-Man, ever the genius, realizing, right, just this wild combination of these two opposing forces, essentially activates the sprinkler. And when he does, he grabs Electro, drags him down into the water, which basically kills them both. It kills Electro and Hydro Man and burns everything up, right? Electricity and water don't mix. So he kills these two right off the bat. Following that, you have Scorpion, who's the sixth member of the group. Scorpion doesn't really last very long, right? In fact, the way in which Scorpion's defeated is just by Spider-Man kicking him out of the building, right? And because Scorpion can't fly and there's nothing for him to latch onto, he just falls to his death. Then he finally comes across Mysterio. Now, the coolest thing about this is Mysterio does all his tricks, right? He laughs and he creates illusions and so on, but he basically creates an illusion of Mary Jane Watson, who calls Spider-Man a failure, right? Says, I never loved you. You're nothing but a failure. But then immediately Spider-Man clocks Mysterio, right? Just like shatters the glass around his head. And it's like, what's in the smoke, Mysterio? Some kind of fear hallucinogen. He's like, some advice? Do not dress up like a man's dead wife. Not unless he pays you to. And so seemingly just leaves him there. And likely Mysterio is exposed to his own hallucinogen and then most likely ends up going insane. But what happens after that is Kraven steps up. Now, one of the things that makes Kraven so incredibly dangerous and so incredibly powerful is that while he doesn't really have any traditional superpowers per se, that he's made himself immune to virtually every poison, right? He is familiar with virtually every toxin, so the fear hallucinogen of Mysterio isn't really going to bother him too much. And so what he does is he immediately goes directly after Spider-Man. But because of what it is that's happening, what he does is he comments to himself. He says, straight towards death, towards the ones I fear the most, right? Basically seeing Aunt May and Uncle Ben and MJ and J. Jonah Jameson as Kraven. He sees them instead of Kraven the Hunter. He says, but you, Kraven, what do you see? And the thing that Kraven fears the most, oddly enough, is a rhinoceros. A gigantic rhinoceros, which doesn't really surprise me. You guys ever seen what a pissed off rhinoceros looks like, man? Those things stand on business. I wouldn't want to piss one of them off. But because of what had happened with the Sandman's daughter, he ends up just like taking out all these soldiers and then going up into the building. And he gets Spider-Man the reprieve. Now, Spider-Man does come across Venom. And in fact, Venom kind of taunts him for a little bit. But one of the things that this reveals is that the reason why Venom's doing all of this is basically a vendetta, right? He's like, look at me, Peter. I am the one responsibility that you shirked. You brought me to this city and made me its prisoner. And where Peter says, I mean, I never thought about that, the response of Venom is, no, you didn't. How could? The world revolves around my existence, Peter Parker. I was lonely, Peter, so lonely. So finally, I made arrangements to have some friends over for dinner, and they are having you for dinner, all of you. And so it's one of these things where it's a very, very human response, right? Because this whole motivation of Venom comes down to the idea that he feels like Spider-Man abandoned him, right? It's a logical conclusion to some degree on the aftermath of Peter getting rid of the Venom symbiote and the symbiote never truly becoming a good guy and Eddie Brock likely dying in some capacity. And so as he's dealing with all these symbiotes and whatnot, he ends up coming across Sandman, and where he expects Sandman to essentially pick a fight, basically to say like, now I'm going to finally destroy you, yada, yada, yada. Instead, he just says, all 6 of us were controlled by explosives implanted into our bodies. Waters held the detonator. I had no choice but to follow orders. You understand? Anger and courage and truth, they're the daughters of hope. Did you know that? And he says, yeah, you probably knew that. I mean, Hope's your department superhero. Me, I got a date with truth. And so what he does is he basically goes to confront all these symbiotes alongside Venom himself and leaves the detonator with Spider-Man. And so where Spider-Man is about to die, right, set upon by all these symbiotes, he activates the detonator and the explosion destroys Venom and all the other symbiotes with it. So Spider-Man effectively saved the day. And so while there isn't some kind of great big huge long drawn out conclusion to this, all we really find out is that the city's not really safe anymore, right? That mass youths have returned to the streets, muggings and all kinds of violence have ensued yet again. But we have our freedom, guys. So But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Because they're doing a sequel that we may cover, and I will catch you all later. Peace.